And the first slide here that you'll see is upcoming webinars. So just a reminder too, if you haven't signed up for some of these World Language Professional Learning Series webinars that are coming up, definitely give them a look. As always, this is available on our New York State website, the one that Candy frequently references, and I'm sure you've all bookmarked by now. I know I have, and I'm constantly sharing it with my teachers. So welcome to Centering Voices, Representation Within and Through World Language Classrooms. My name is Diana Perez, and I've been teaching in the Syracuse district now for 18 years. This is my first year as an impact coach. No longer in the classroom, but now coaching teachers.
And my name is Ingrid Paredes. I am also from Syracuse City School District. This is my 20th year as an educator. I have been a Spanish teacher in the classroom in both middle school and high school, as well as an instructional coach. And I currently serve as a vice principal at PSLA at Fowler within the Syracuse City School District. We're very excited to be here today.
Yes. As a reminder, when you see these symbols, if you see the mic, remember to keep your microphone on mute during the webinar. If you see the blue think bubble, that's just some time for you to think to yourself about whatever we have on the slide. The green chat little dialogue there is for you to write in the chat, and we will have some time at the end to answer some questions. And the little folder icon just reminds you that whatever we're showing is available in the shared folder. So here's our goals for today. We hope that all of us by the end of the day can do the following: identify the main elements of culture and identity within myself and my students, and understand how the identities of my students, target language cultures, and the New York State culturally responsive sustaining education framework are integrated in the New York State World Language Standards. So we'll do that by working through a series of topics. And you can think about this as a funnel where culture and identity is the widest part of the funnel. And then as we work our way down, things get more and more narrow. So we'll talk about culture and identity. We'll talk about how those things show up in the New York State CRSE framework, which the state has provided for us to guide our instruction and make sure that it's culturally responsive. We'll talk about what that means with our new New York State World Language Standards, particularly the 2 culture standards. And then lastly, we'll think about our bridge to practice. I mean, what does that look like in our actual classrooms, and what can we do to make sure that we're being culturally responsive and honoring cultures and identities in our classrooms? So let's start, like I said, at the widest part of that funnel with culture. Zaretta Hammond has given us a great framework to use to think about culture. She uses this tree and 3 levels of culture. So if you've never seen this before, it's a great way to just sort of work through and think about, when we say culture, what do we mean? Surface level culture is observable elements, things like food, music, dress, holidays, language, those things that we can very easily see. These things also carry a very low emotional charge. The next level is shallow. These are more unspoken rules, social norms, things like nonverbal communication, eye contact, and personal space. These have a slightly greater, stronger emotional charge. And deep culture is much more deeply seated things like our worldviews, our cultural archetypes, our mental models, our core beliefs as a group, our values, for example, collectivism versus individualism, our funds of knowledge. These are sort of bedrock things that make us who we are, depending on the culture that we grew up in, and tend to have a much more intense emotional charge. So we're going to use this framework to think about culture as we move through the webinar today. One way we can think about deep cultural archetype is to think about collectivism versus individualism. So I'll just pause here for a minute, for about 30 seconds, and have you read these 3 quotes and think to yourself about the difference between the 3 quotes and just where you fall in terms of which of these quotes resonates most with you in your cultural upbringing. And on the next slide, you can see a range of sort of where different countries fall on a range of collectivism versus individualism. And this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the United States is very individualistic and can't also be collectivist in some ways. But the idea here is that some cultures are much more focused on the individual and individual success and achievement, and others are much more focused on the collective, the group success. And that will a lot of times influence the culture, influence the practices and the products, to use the words from our standards, that end up being things that we see in the culture. So it's important and actually interesting to think about that. And again, here, just pause and think about where you might fall on this range based on the country or culture that you grew up in.
Yana, as we continue to think of the collectivism and individualism, I also invite you to think of our students as well as the cultures of the target language that we are teaching in our classrooms and making connections in our classrooms. And the reality is that for many of our students, it may be a mixture of cultures, especially if our students are multilingual learners and are in your classrooms, and perhaps they have an upbringing that connects different cultures. So it is a spectrum, and it changes for each individual student, which is why we want to move on a little bit down that funnel, if you visualize it a little bit more, into the concept of identity. We may have a culture that in general guides us, but the identity is unique to each one of us. It is our identity as educators, as well as the students in your classroom, and the identity of the communities of the target language that you are teaching in your classrooms. When we think of identity, there is not one single definition. One of the ideas of identity is the concept of intersectionality, where the individual is at the center of this intersectionality, and that is defined, or that is created rather, by your influence of race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, religion, ability, sexuality, mental health, age, education, body size, to just name a few. So how all of these different elements of your life, of your experiences, come together is what is creating your identity. And this is true for our students, as well as for the different people that we want to connect in the target language classrooms. Furthermore, I invite you to think of the idea that identity has two parts, right? We have the identity of what is seen, things that, what aspects of my identity are visible to others. Similar to when you think of the tree, that surface culture piece, things that are maybe easy to see, that are part of your identity. There are other aspects that we choose to share. They may not necessarily be overt and be easily identifiable in my identity, but I choose to share that with the people around me. And then there are pieces of our identity that are not seen. And some of them may not be visible to others, like at times, perhaps an ability. I always share the stories of some students who, and some teachers and even myself, who they may not see that we speak different languages, right? So in my case, I make a point of sharing that I am multilingual, that English is in fact my third language. And I share that with the students because for many, it is a connection of their identity, and it validates their identity that, oh, I am also a multilingual learner. And now we have a way to connect through our common identity piece. But that is something that perhaps they may not know right away. And so it is something that I choose to share with them. Now, there are other aspects of our identity that are not visible to others. Like, for example, in some cases with some of my students, it is a ability. It may be a reading ability or disability. It can be all of our students that are that have things in their lives that are not just ready to share, and that's okay. But what's important to think about is not about forcing them to share what they're not comfortable with, but rather to acknowledge that that is still part of who they are. It still frames their identity, and it's important for us to hold that space to allow them to be their full selves, even if we don't have every piece of information. And then there are other aspects of our identity that we choose as individuals, we choose not to share. That could be sometimes because there may be trauma in our lives. I work, Diana and I work in inner city schools. So we see different things in our schools, and some students are not ready to share. Some are not, and that's okay. So what is important to understand about the identity is it frames who we are, and we don't always see it. Sometimes we choose to provide information. Sometimes we choose to withhold that information. And none of those pieces or those choices change who we are. But as teachers, we need and we must create a safe space so that every student can come and be their true selves, can be a part of our classrooms, right? With their full spectrum. And that is going to enrich our cultures. In addition to that, we want to also start thinking, and we'll speak more in a few slides about this, how do we connect as teachers with our students? Because identity also refers to us. What are we as teachers bringing forth? And to make sure that we are not only connecting, but also understanding that there are differences and similarities. And how are we connecting with our students and understanding all of these interactions so that we can be more culturally responsive in our classrooms as well as our cultures. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to just reflect for yourselves. What is the identity, you as an educator, that you allow your students or allow the people around you to see, and what is not seen? I'll give you 30 seconds to reflect. So now we take it to that next step, right? So we have a better understanding of our own identities and our own intersectionality and what we are bringing as an educator, as a teacher, as a collaborator in all of this cultural journey into the classroom. So now take a moment and think, what about the students in front of us? What is seen and unseen in the identities of the students in front of us and the people in the target language cultures that we are working on? Whose voice are we centering? Is it your own teacher voice and your own experience? Is it just one group of students? We know New York State is a very diverse state. We also know that different regions in the state have a different dynamic of diversity, right? Our demographics change. We work in an inner city, we work in Syracuse. That is going to look very different even from our own suburbs. When we talk about areas in Buffalo, in Rochester, in Binghamton, in Watertown, right, in Utica, in New York City, in Albany, all of the different regions, they all have unique demographics. So do we know what are the students that are in front of us? Not just the majority, but who are the students in our classrooms? How do you fit in, and how are we identifying the people in the target language? And this is when I want you to take a moment and just, again, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to reflect, because it's important for us to see that dynamic and how understanding identity for yourself, for your students in front of you, as well as for the people of the target language culture is important, because there is its own intersectionality between the three groups. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about that and just reflect. These two reflection questions are also in one of the handouts that is currently on your Google Drive folder. Now that we have had time to kind of reflect and think about this, I'm going to challenge you one more step. Who are the marginalized voices in our classrooms, in our curriculum, in our student groups? And perhaps you represent one of the groups. Perhaps you're not, but how are we bringing those voices to be centered? Some marginalized include, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, our immigrant and refugee groups, African descendants, indigenous peoples from all over the world, in some areas and in some countries, women, as well as people who are differently abled. So we need to, again, understand whose voice are we centering, and are we providing and empowering our students to fully understand all groups. In the specific case of Spanish, which is what Diana and I taught, are we bringing the Afro-Latino voice? Are we bringing the Amerindians from different regions, right? From Mexico? Are we talking about the Quechua? Are we talking about, the Mapuche in Chile? Who are we talking about when we talk about the indigenous people? Are we using our resources in the classroom to provide students and expose students and opportunities to connect with all different people that represent our target language? And we're going to explore how that connects specifically to our standards a little bit more, but I want you to keep that in mind, because it is important to remember that as we are using authentic resources, we want to make sure that we not only are they true, right? And just looking at sources, are they quality sources, but are they centering all of the cultural pieces and all of the voices that we want centered in our classrooms? And this connects with with the state's culturally responsive and sustaining education framework. One of the things that New York State has done, and I just need to unshare so I can show you the link. In your PowerPoint, you will see that there is a link. This takes you straight to the website. One moment, because I want to show you exactly where that leads you. Can you, Diana, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Perfect, thank you. I'm maneuvering different screens, so I want to make sure that you can see what I can see. The link sends you to the NYS Culturally Responsive and Sustaining Education Framework. I can't tell you how wonderful this document is. As an educator, as a parent in New York State of 2 students, as an administrator, and as a teacher, this is a guiding document that allows me to start my journey, to continue my journey, because the entry-level points are wonderful. And I am going to just guide you to one specific page just to give you an overall, right? So the framework is it focuses on students, but it gives us 4 different areas. It looks at welcoming and affirming environment, inclusive curriculum and assessment, high expectations and rigorous instruction, and ongoing professional learning and support, which is one of the things we are doing right now in terms of the culture piece. In addition to that, it is organized by 7 stakeholder groups: teachers, school leaders, district leaders. We have the education department and policymakers. We have students and families. We have community members. So as you come into this document, and I do strongly encourage you to do so, it will give you specific steps that you can take to start integrating and becoming more culturally responsive and sustaining in your own classrooms. So I will take one moment and go back to the PowerPoint, if it allows me, from current slide. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the culturally responsive and sustaining framework, and we're going to then go into a lot of what we're talking has to do with valuing and really focusing on the assets that our students bring in and that the curriculum can bring and be presented to our students. I also wanted to bring your attention to some of the work that Zaretta Hammond has done with dimensions of equity to put things in context. We have heard about multicultural education, which celebrates diversity. They create positive social interactions across differences, as well as exposes our privileged students to diverse perspectives and help students of color see themselves reflected. This is some of our older ideas, even in some teacher preparation programs about multicultural education and including different things in our context, in our classrooms. We've also heard of our social justice education, which exposes the social political context or student experience. It raises our students' consciousness about inequity in everyday social, environmental, and economic and political aspects. And it creates that lens, right? It empowers our students to become active in causes that they believe in causes of equity. We also have culturally responsive education, which focuses on improving the learning capacity of our diverse students. It centers around that cognitive aspects of teaching and learning, building resilience and academic mindset by pushing back on the dominant narratives about people of color. Here is when you think about the idea of what Zaretta Hammond calls the pobrecito syndrome. Oh, our poor babies, they can't, this is too hard, they can't do it, so let's kind of water it down. No, culturally responsive education is saying, okay, that they may not be at a level, or have you really thought of their assets? How can they demonstrate what they know and really support the classroom learning, because they know a lot, right? How are we empowering our students, especially our students of color, to come to the classroom, come to the table, so to speak, and present everything that they have and be an active part while engaging them in academic rigor. In general, for summary purposes, we can say that multicultural education is content. A lot of our social justice education engages, so it's about their environment, while culturally responsive education is empowering our students, and it's focused on that student. It is not one or the other. All three are important. We just need to make sure that we understand the clarity of what each of these types of education or context or things that you can do. They all have a different purpose, right? So they all work together and they can collaborate together, but they're not interchangeable. That's the most important thing. They're not interchangeable. Back to our culturally responsive framework from New York State. This is how they define it. I'm going to give you a moment to read, and then I will bring some points up. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds, take a time and read this definition. As you can see by the underlining, I want to bring your attention to the idea of multiple expressions of diversity, which connects with what we talked about of the intersectionality and identity. These are just some of the examples, but these are things that New York State values in our educational system to make sure that we want our students to be able to provide that, bring that to the table as assets, which is the other word that is underlined here, because they all bring something, they can all teach us something, and they all are valued members of our classroom community. They all have different experiences, and it just allows us to grow in our classroom. This is the moment that sometimes we have to understand the ideas of implicit bias or microaggressions, and that is to our students in the classroom, as well as to our target cultures, right? Our target language cultures, because we are talking about languages that are spoken in the United States, outside of the United States, all over the world. And we have to be very careful with the implicit bias, at times, the microaggressions that can occur in those classrooms. So again, being intentional about bringing equity into our classrooms and focusing on whose voices are we centering every time. Whose voice are we centering? Our students, the diversity in our classrooms. And with that, the key is that balance. We know how to love our students. World language teachers, we know how to love our students. That is so true. Every time I walk into a world language classroom, we know how to love our students and how to provide the fun activities, right? We connect. A lot of times we connect through that surface level culture. We start there. It's important. We're not saying don't do that. We're saying that is an entry point, but do not stop there. Dig deeper. Once they feel comfortable with the surface level, then go into that shallow, and then you connect with that deep level. We need to make sure that we are intentional in providing academic rigor and high expectations, developing those connections with our students. No student is going to come to you or your classroom and share what is that deep cultural piece unless they feel comfortable. And so sometimes you start, that entry level is the surface. They feel comfortable, then you go into the shallow, they feel comfortable, then you kind of are able to dig deeper into that deep culture piece. So we need to ensure that in order to continue to hear more about those voices, and as we connect with the standards and that comparison, that standard 5, when we are comparing products and practices, to really compare all of what's going on and what's behind it, we need to create a safe learning environment so that our students feel that they can truly be themselves and connect to our target cultures. Diana?
And so in the same way that Ingrid mentioned that we're fortunate that we have the New York State CRSE framework, we're also very fortunate that we now have brand new standards, and that part of our job actually includes teaching about and involving culture. So you probably are already familiar with Standard 4 and Standard 5, but just to refresh everybody's memory, Standard 4 is relating cultural practices and products to perspectives, right? That learners use the target language to identify, describe, and explain the practices and products of the culture studied, as well as the cultural perspectives they suggest. And again, as I'm reading these, just sort of keep thinking about that culture tree, keep thinking about that intersectionality that we talked about earlier. Standard 5 is about cultural comparisons, like Ingrid just said. So in that sense, learners use the target language to identify, describe, compare, and explain the practices, products, and perspectives of the cultures studied and their own. So here they need their own piece, right? First, they need to have a deep understanding of themselves first. And of course, that will vary depending on the age of the student you're working with. But let's take a quick look here at the performance indicators, because our performance indicators give us some really good food for thought as we dig deeper into these standards and what they might end up meaning or how they might end up showing up in our lessons. So I've already read the standard for you, but I'll just read the guiding question here and pause, give you some time to think. How can I identify, describe, and explain cultural perspectives by examining cultural products and practices? And again, think here, surface level, surface level, shallow level, and then deep level. How can I identify, describe, and explain cultural perspectives by examining cultural products and practices? And I'll just bring your attention too to the fact that each of these target ranges, if you look in the colored boxes, each of these boxes here mentions my own culture. So I'll just read you the first one. I can identify cultural products and practices in my own and other cultures to help me understand perspectives using words and phrases with graphic or visual support. So again, here it starts with them understanding themselves and their own cultures, right? Our students need to understand that. We as teachers need to understand ourselves and our own cultures, and then to be able to understand perspectives and products that other cultures have in the target language cultures. And then the same thing here for Standard 5. So again, I already read you the standard, but just pause and think here for a minute. How can I identify, describe, and explain cultural comparisons by examining the products and practices of other cultures and my own, keeping in mind the culture tree, keeping in mind the identity wheel? Just pause and think for a minute. And in the shared documents, you'll find a sheet that'll give you some more prompting questions like this. But Ingrid and I thought that these were really good guiding questions as we think about the sort of most narrow part of our funnel now and what this ends up looking like in our classrooms, right? In our bridge to practice. So how do we take our thinking about So Rada Hammond's culture tree and the identity wheel and what the New York State CRSE framework gives us. And what do we do in a tangible way in our classroom to make sure that our world language standards are visible?
So as we talk about bridge to practice, a little context. New York State World Language Standards 4 and 5 are not just about teaching culture in our classroom. We need to integrate culturally responsive teaching in the world language classroom to empower our students to understand, integrate, connect, and expand their learning of their cultural assets, their own cultural assets, and the classroom curricula to become independent learners and active citizens. It's not just about what we're teaching, but in addition to that, we have to really connect with the standards, because what the standards are asking our students to do is to make those connections, understand their own cultural assets, the target language cultural assets, and make those connections. So we need to make sure that we look at the standards as a whole and not just as what we're teaching about, but rather how are we connecting? That is part of the important context and challenge that we have as teachers on a daily basis. I apologize, that was double clicking. A little kind of summary. If you think of our big box as a culturally responsive and sustaining education, that encompasses everything, right? That's kind of like our umbrella. Our student culture and identity is a part of it. Our New York State World Language Standards are a part of it. How we are, to use that famous word, intersectionality, how are we being intentional about that intersectionality in our practice, in our classroom? That is what Diana and I refer to bridge to practice. How are we bringing this together and applying it in our classroom? That is when we have to be intentional in everything that we do in our planning and in our implementation.
So here's a list of some ideas. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, but these are some tangible things that you can start to do that are based on all the things we've talked about today. So NYU has what's called a culturally responsive education scorecard. I'll show it to you in just a sec. And you can do an audit of your own curriculum, textbooks, materials, classrooms. You can participate, be a part of that process, whether it's in your own classroom, just on a small scale, or it's part of your district where you're, for example, if you're adopting a new textbook or as we roll out these new standards, making sure that they're culturally responsive, that the people, the examples we're using, the authentic texts and materials are representative of the breadth and depth of what it means to be a target language speaker or to be a student in front of us, right? What are we showing the whole range of that? You could do a culture tree activity with your classes. I've seen places where they do a tree on the wall and just add to it all year. So students will put their leaves for their surface level stuff, and then their shallow level stuff, it'll be a different part of the tree, and then their deep culture stuff will be the roots of the tree. And it's a great practice for you to do as a teacher, to show your culture tree or to put things on a culture tree, for example, on a wall. And then encourage students to do that, like put the pieces of your culture that are visible up here on the top as the leaves. Put the stuff that's not visible that you're willing to share that's deep on the roots, right? And then as you teach about the target language culture or cultures, add leaves more and more, right? Add parts to the root or to the trunk of the tree so that they can see that here's all of the sort of surface level stuff, here's the shallow level stuff, and here's the deeper level culture stuff, and how it all comes together. Me as a student, me as a teacher, the students in front of me, and the target language culture. Teach variance on vocabulary as a normal part of language rather than assigning value to one country's culture or word choice over another. I remember when I was going to study abroad, my university offered either Spain or Ecuador, and I'd always wanted to go to the Amazon rainforest for whatever reason. I've had that in my head since I was 13. So I was like, going to Ecuador. And I told one of my friends in college, and she was like, why would you want to go to Ecuador? Go to Spain. As if like there wasn't some amazing experience and learning I could have in Ecuador, right? It ended up being an amazing experience, but I think she really thought that the Spain variant of Spanish was like where it was at. And I sensed that too from other people as I went through my own experiences and learning. I've sensed that before, but as teachers, it's really so important to teach the variants, especially if you're in a diverse district like we are, where there's lots of Spanish speakers. You know, there's lots of ways to speak, and that's okay. Contextualize content in order to connect with the students' experiences and communities and build on background knowledge and experiences. And it's so important here to do that through joy and asset-based perspective. So make it meaningful for them, right? Bring in who they are, their culture, treat as an asset, not as a deficit. And feature and highlight resources by traditionally marginalized voices. We've talked about all these potentially marginalized voices. And again, it's not an exhaustive list here, but make sure that you're highlighting resources, authentic resources by a diverse group of people in your classroom. This is an example of something that I think about, just a couple of questions that I think about, and I mentioned this already a little bit, but I always think about when I'm showing images on the PowerPoint, when I'm giving students something on a digital course, like a Canvas course or something like that, and I'm including images. Am I showing the full spectrum of what it means to be a target language speaker? And am I showing the full spectrum of what it means to be a student learning, interacting, and engaging with the target language and its cultures? This is these are a couple of screen grabs from that NYU inventory. We've also linked that in this PowerPoint, so you'll have access to that document and can link to it. The first part of the document kind of explains it, but then if you scroll down a little bit, you'll get these pages and you can actually just print them out. And we would highly encourage you to participate if your district has an opportunity to participate, or has an opportunity for you to participate in really doing an audit of your materials to see, are they really representative of a diverse group of people?
Vocabulary variations. I love vocabulary variations. Personally, I had the opportunity to grow up in different countries in South America. So I got to experience vocabulary variations as a child. And I, for a very long time, had no idea what palta was until I found out it was aguacate, right? So all of the different things that even as a native speaker, as a heritage Spanish speaker, I go to a different country and I am learning every day. So I love to impart that, and I love the joy that you see for our heritage speakers that are taking a world language classroom when they see how they speak at home reflected and not only normalized, but used as an asset in the classroom vocabulary. Their eyes just brighten up. And I have this one student who, it happened to be during COVID year, just the most recent story and memory. The student was at home. We all remember teaching online. I know it feels like a long time ago, but let's, just for the story, we were going through the vocabulary, and all of a sudden, the student unmuted, screen went on. Profe, miss. Mamá lo dice así. Mom says it that way. And it was China. For those of you who are Spanish teachers, we were talking about naranja, orange, right? So I had naranja, China, we had all of the different variations. His mom, all of a sudden, the student became very engaged and was bringing and participating, because in every slide, I also say, ¿y tú? ¿Cómo lo dices? And you, how do you say it? Because I don't assume I know all the words. I try to be inclusive, but I miss some. And so I always bring in their voices and their participation, and, oh, you say it this way. Okay. And then, so we add it, it's interactive, right? So the student became more participatory in it, and then we were back in person, and he was active. Fast forward to this year, I am now a vice principal at the high school. The story happened when I was at the middle school teaching, and he is one of our students. And I ran into mom in the office, and she said to me, she said it to me in Spanish, but she said to me, that day, I saw my son be proud of who he was. For the first time, this is a 7th grader, for the first time, he was not embarrassed about speaking Spanish outside of the classroom. As a mother, as a teacher, as a heritage speaker, my eyes water just telling this, but the chills that I received, the impact, right, that we have on our students, on our children, and their identity is that big. By doing something that you would consider simple, it might take you a few minutes to add these versions, but do it, because what we are telling our students, what they understand from what we're doing, from teaching vocabulary variations, is you are valued. How you speak, how you refer to things, in this case, food, is valued, is an asset, and is welcomed in this classroom. On the other side, Diana and I have also had experiences where we have had students say, oh, my teacher doesn't allow me to say it that way. Again, I'm at a loss for words, because the impact to that student's identity. I know there is no way that a textbook or a curriculum may list every variation for every single word that there is for, out there as a vocabulary list, but I encourage you, I ask of you to be open-minded and present and acknowledge and respect the different variations that every language and every culture brings to the table, and honor them as assets. Include them, have them teach a piece of the lesson. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. Because remember, whose voice are we centering, right? Whose voice are we centering in the classroom? We're centering the voice of our students. We want to center the voice of that target language classroom in culture that we are teaching in our classroom. We want to open our students' minds and hearts to make deep connections between the products and the practices of that target language with their own. With that, we want to wrap up and conclude, review our goals to identify main elements of culture and identity within myself and my students, as well as understand how the identities of my students, target language cultures, and the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework are integrated in the New York State Language Standards.